I'm wet behind the ears. And
here we go.
Here we go.
Let's see. Looking to make sure we got who's in the room here. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar. We at the Resilience Community of Interest are excited to be bringing this topic to you today. My name is Breck Wilsusen. I'm a longstanding member of the Resilience COI, including its previous iterations. We reach out to find relevant content on any topic regarding resilience. We're even starting a speakers bureau so that people can take some of these presentations that you see on webinars and bring them into your local post and for further discussion or in-person luncheon topic. But on behalf of the Resilience COI, welcome again. Also want to give a shout out, thank you for the SAME staff, and particularly Karen and Carl for their support today. Some housekeeping notes and tips. If you're having trouble connecting, the VPNs could be the problem. We are web enabled and through Big Marker. And if anything you missed, this webinar is being recorded. And so that'll be up on the SAME webpage about a week from now. Questions. When you get to questions in the presentation, I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. We are going to see who is coming to, or who is attending this webinar. So I would ask you to go ahead and submit, do the poll so that we can see who we're serving today. But I'll be monitoring questions. We'll save a lot of them to the end, and so put them in the Q&A tab, or put them in the chat tab, and the moderators will be moving them as they come through. I want to introduce Mr. Ted Strickfus. I've had the opportunity to observe him for several years now. He's the Deputy District Engineer. He's been with the Corps office in Omaha, or with U.S. Corps of Engineers for over 27 years. And I've watched him mentor, support, and lead in concert with more than 6 district commanders. I've also observed him in this past dozen years, mentoring several men, to include one who was a future Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. His responsibilities go to about $1.9 billion worth of projects and assets that he has to maintain. The levee system is the one that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to click on do it later because it's just blocking my view. Ted has been a PE since 1989, and he's got his professional management PMP certification about a decade ago as well. So let me set up the situation for you. We've had some incredible flooding in this last decade or so here in the Omaha area. The section of the Missouri River from the hills just south of Hamburg, Iowa, all the way up to Sioux City, Iowa, where the people have lost homes. They've been flooded out. Farms have been very inundated and have to reestablish the farmland. So this happened in 2011, and it also happened in 2019. The governors of 4 states came together and said, we cannot do business as usual. We've got to come up with some other way. What Ted's about to show you is the results of all of that research. Ted, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Breck, and really welcome to everyone. My name's Ted Strickfus, as Breck indicated. I've been the DPM here in Omaha District for a long period of time. It's been going on a dozen years. The ironic thing is, when I became DPM about 3 months later, we had the flood of 11, which is what we euphemistically called the first big bash of water coming down the Missouri River, caused a lot of damage. As I walk through this slide deck, you're going to see a lot of pictures because I am a firm believer that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And you can see on this opening slide, that you're supposed to have on the left picture, you're supposed to have dry ground on one side of that picture. But unfortunately, the entire system was inundated and overtopped by an event that fell outside of the Corps' purview for control. A lot of the rivers that came in, and I've got some slide deck that talk to this, were unregulated. So as a result, Mother Nature dealt us a blow, and this is the unfortunate consequence. What I find very interesting, I've been, I got to update my bio, but I've actually been in Omaha District for a little over 35 years now. And I have the pleasure of working with hydraulic engineers and geotechnical engineers who've put their entire career into the care and management of the levee systems adjacent to the Missouri River and on the tributaries. And there was significant emotion within the Corps as they looked at basically their career, if you will, being negatively impacted by this torrential downpour precipitation that ended up overtopping and basically causing more than 50 breaches on the levee system between Omaha and Rouleau, Nebraska. And that is to say nothing of the significant impact to all of the landowners, the small communities, everyone that lived adjacent to and within the floodplain of the Missouri River. So we're going to have an opportunity today to kind of walk through some of the things that we've done. I preface this by saying I became DPM right at the flood of 11. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, what we ended up having was a highly trained group of professionals within Omaha District, because we had just gotten done fixing the system up from the flood of 11, and then flood of 19 comes, and then here we are. So if you would, buckle up. We'll walk through this. I'll kind of give you a running diatribe as we do talk about what the precipitation event looked like. And subsequently, I've got a couple of slides where I'll pause and talk a little bit about the lessons learned or the after action review comments that became so important, or the springboard to what I consider to be pretty much the standard of operation for the enterprise, for the core enterprise, as we look to opportunities and these type of events that happen all too routinely, it seems, within the nation. So just to give a quick caricature of the flood event, you see the flows that occurred within all of these tributaries, the pretty colored spaghetti board, if you will. On the right side going north-south is the Missouri River. But it's the tributaries that ended up causing such devastation. The Platte River specifically, the Niobrara River up along the border of Nebraska and South Dakota, and many of the tribs coming through Iowa came down, and you can see some of these flows that are highlighted at Nebraska River, at Nebraska City. We had over 340,000 cubic feet per second of flow that the river was carrying during the peak of this flood event during the March event. The releases from the Gavin Points Dam up in South Dakota, which is the furthest south dam of the 6 main stem dams on the Missouri River, they peaked at 100,000 CFS in 2011. They ran 160,000 CFS for months on end, but they're two very significantly different flooding events. The 2019 event was driven by unregulated flows in the tribs south of the reservoir system in Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. 2011 was largely an upper basin precipitation event where we're maxed out the capacity of the reservoir system, a little over 63 million acre feet of runoff during that year, highest runoff year on record. 2019 was just behind that at 62.8. So basically the same amount of flow, but a significant amount of flow downstream. This is going to kind of set up the precipitation event, and you never let a good event go by without coining a new word that you're able to apply to it. But this, we ended up with rain on top of frozen ground, on top of snow, the further north you got in our area of responsibility. And it ended up being what was affectionately termed as a bombogenesis by those people within the weather forecasting purview. So you can see, it's I guess some would call this a beautiful picture. I call it kind of ominous and frankly a little bit scary. But as this weather track came up across the western part of Nebraska, saturating the ground, the frozen ground, with upwards of 3 to 4 inches of rainfall. And then across the state of South Dakota, we ended up with significant bands of heavy, wet snow, all courtesy of starting on the 13th of March. I can remember on the 12th of March, Tuesday, the forecasts were, well, we could see a moderate increase in stage on the river systems. And that dramatically changed over the course of about 30 hours, where we transitioned from it shouldn't be too bad to what became a very cataclysmic and just a catastrophic event that heavily impacted to the tune of nearly $1 billion worth of damage within a multi-state area. This provides a QPF of the 3-day precipitation across Nebraska and South Dakota. You can see the dark tans are really indicative of a 4-inch amount of precipitation over very large areas that ended up providing significant inflow into the Missouri River system. Interesting to note that during the event, with the main stem dams at our disposal, we were able to terminate flow at Fort Randall on the Missouri River in order to try to mitigate and reduce the risk to the downstream event that we know is going to be coming in through all the unregulated tributaries. So at Fort Randall, we minimized the amount of flow and to zero, and then the rest of the flow was driven by the tributaries that came into the Missouri River system.
So Ted?
Yes, go ahead.
You have the ability to shut off the Missouri River.
Yes, we do.
That's
through those main stem dams. It's something that is it's very atypical. We've probably only done that during my career, maybe twice. It's not something that's obviously routinely considered, but this was the classic event where downstream flows, our inability to control the flow in the Platte on the Little Sioux, Big Sioux, the Niobrara, forced drastic action, and we had the flexibility to be able to terminate that flow at Fort Randall. And basically over the course of the next 12 to 18 hours, you saw that tail race from Fort Randall begin to decline as that flow cessation from Fort Randall began to take to effect. Unfortunately, Niobrara flows into Lewis and Clark, which is above Gavin's Point, which again forced Gavin's Point to have to continue to increase flows up to that 100,000 CFS flow rate, which on today, I guess today's flow rate coming out of Gavin's Point is around 13,000 CFS. A normal spring flow. We have transitioned to drought conditions. The irony of that should be appealing to many. But so we're in a situation now where we are reducing flows in order to protect downstream interest in water intakes and navigation responsibilities and those type of things. But we're currently running 13,000 CFS. So you transition from a system that's running 100,000 CFS to today's flow rate of 13,000. You can see why this was such a dramatic event during March of 2019.
Understood. That's a factor of 8.
Exactly. Find it interesting, really focused today on the conversation related to that March event, but 2019 was an ugly year in many different ways. In the absence of the main stem dams in Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota, it really served to mitigate or temper some of the peaks. You can see here that in essence, we had 3 very significant unregulated events during the spring, summer, and fall of 2019. So we were in flood for basically 3/4 of the year. And you see the 3 circles that depict when we got significant rainfall events that pushed already damaged systems into an operating scenario where we were trying to flood fight while we're actively trying to do system repairs caused by the breaches from that March event. So it was a really tough, ugly year. And I really have to give accolades really to local and state EM to the Corps of Engineers. Certainly we were out there, boots on ground through the entirety, for many of the communities that also rolled up their sleeves and they sandbagged and they provided a lot of those activities. When you see water coming, it's really an all hands on deck type of a situation. So now, once again, we're going to walk through and you're going to see a whole bunch of water. And really the takeaway is holy smokes. But then I want to get to what the Corps of Engineers, what Omaha District looked to do to try to do things differently. Breck talked about it or touched on it at the beginning of the conversation. After the damages occurred, the 4 governors from the state of Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas came together and they basically said, boy, we can't continue to do this every 9 years, every 8 years. We have to do things differently. We have to think differently. We have to think more resiliently. And this presentation today, I really try to focus in on some of those things that we really focused on doing differently. At the end of the day, the federal government, through the PL 8499 program, which is our opportunity to work with local and state communities to basically assist them in the management of federal and non-federal levee systems. We have a commitment to them that we very quickly work to repair damaged systems. And there's benefit cost ratios associated with that. There's a responsibility to be prudent stewards of the tax dollar. Within that background construct, we're being pushed by the 4 governors to be able to do things differently and work within the construct of law, of national law, in order to be able to get after that. So we had some great successes. We'll walk through those. I'm sitting up here in the green area, Omaha, Nebraska. Above Omaha, we did have some residual flooding, but it did not overtop the levee systems. Everything below Omaha, and these 2 figures can be stitched together. The one on the right basically is a continuation of the figure on the left. We have levee systems, and they've all got a name, L 611, 614. What does that mean? Well, it's river mile 611 to 614. And when you say L or R, you're basically standing in the middle of the river, looking at the direction the river flows downstream, and your left hand are considered left bank systems. Your right hand is considered right bank systems. So we have a lot of L designated levees. The majority of the levees on the Missouri River from Omaha down to Rulo, which is the southern extent of my area responsibility, are left bank systems. The right bank largely consists of the Missouri River bluff. There are some right bank levees, but the predominance of the levees are left bank oriented. The dark purple were overtopped, did not breach. All the rest of the levees, that orangish tan color, are levee systems that overtopped and subsequently breached. So in essence, every levee system from Omaha south, with the exception of those couple of purples, were breached. All of the yellow dots that you see are either inlet or outlet breaches. And it becomes very important as you look at this catastrophe to understand, as we walked into it, the 14th of March came and went. Commander and I were in a chopper flying up and down the river system, watching the river come up, watching the levees begin to overtop, watching the levees begin to fail. Very powerless situation to be in. There was no flood fighting that could go on because the water came up so quickly. And obviously the erosive force of the water on the overtopping led to a lot of breaches. We talked about 52 of them, and we're going to look at some of those pictures in a multitude of locations. So our opportunity as we were flying this levee system was to be able to try to figure out, okay, now what are we going to do once this precipitation event is behind us, and how are we going to tackle the problem? And hydraulically, it is kind of common sense. We made some deliberate decisions working with local sponsors to be able to say, as we get down into this L550 and L536, there was a deliberate strategy on the part of Corps of Engineers working with the levee sponsors to say, we are not going to immediately plug some of the exit breaches within those levee systems, because in essence, all of this water that's now in the floodplain on the supposed dry side of the levee system needs to drain out. So over the passage of time and months, this water flowed north to south and ultimately came out in L536. So for L536, we made a deliberate decision to pause for the better part of a year while the system was allowed to drain. So I'm going to pause a little bit here and talk about some of the challenges, some of the impediments, some of the commitments that the Omaha district made as we met with the governors and really tried to focus on some of the pragmatic realizations. You know, you're looking at people's livelihoods. You're looking at a lot of agricultural interests that were very negatively impacted. We'd just come out of the flood of 11. That was very catastrophic as well. So within the ag community, between the 1st and 15th of March is an important time frame. That's when ag producers working with their insurance carriers really have to have the crop insurance defined. And if there are holes in levees, you can imagine that impacts insurance rates for that ag producer. So our commitment as we walked into this, and again, the water is still at the top of the levees. You really can't strategize and determine scope and extent of damages. But walking into it, we said, you know what, within a year, we want to be in a position where all of the breaches, not only on the Missouri River, but also on the Tribs. We had significant damage on the Elkhorn, on the Platte. We had damages across a vast swath of area that we were responsible for working with those sponsors to effect repair on. So, but with that being stated, our incoming goal was to ensure that we had the levee system plugged so that on the 1st of March that we would have some level of flood protection. I already talked a little bit about that strategy to ensure that we allowed the system to drain out, and we wanted to do the things differently, which was the catchphrase coined by the governors of the 4 states. You got to do things differently. You got to think differently. So we made a deliberate decision and investment in working through a very difficult process, working with USDA, working with Nature Conservancy to try to figure out, are there opportunities for us to perhaps look at the levee system that we have in place and consider doing things differently. Between $650 to $700 million of construction have taken place over the last 2 years. I'm going to pause there. That's a big deal in the Corps of Engineers. Usually within the Corps, any project over $500 million gets coined or gets called what they call a mega or a very large mega project. And with that comes a heightened sense of diligence, greater oversight, purview of higher headquarters to ensure that an investment of that nature, we bring all our forces to bear to ensure that things go well. We, in essence, executed a mega project in 2 years to repair that damaged levee system, which is really a testimony to, I hate to say it, flood of 11. We're very experienced and very aware of what needed to be done going into 19 and coming out of the flood and getting into the repair. Over 11 million yards of material that were placed. A lot of it came from federal properties. We had Missouri River Recovery Program pieces of land adjacent to the Missouri River, which are mitigative components of the Missouri River Recovery Program, which address 2 birds and a fish. Those properties were heavily impacted and damaged by a lot of sedimentation. You know, there was sand carried in by this massive flow all over these ag producing areas, as well as over top of Corps of Engineers property. So we had the opportunity to leverage some of those core properties, remove the sand, use that sand as part of the levee repair scenario, and then be able to work within that recovery program land to turn it to a more usable end state. We talk about doing things differently. That we set back the levees. The river needed room to roam in order to provide greater flood resilience. For those of you that work flood and flood management and levee systems, really, when you talk about doing things differently, when you're talking about controlling a river, not to be too casual about it, but you can stack dirt taller or you can set back the levee system. Setting back a levee system within the construct of law can be difficult. I think we worked through that effectively, but the challenge of being able to address the needs and the authority associated with the project can be significant. We were successful at L594, left bank, and then down at L536, a much larger setback opportunity, working with the local community, and I think that was very successful. Corps of Engineers, we got very good at doing cost reimbursable contracts, working 24 hours a day for a year on end in order to leverage some of our rapid response capabilities and tools. Typically, within the federal government, you don't say use of cost reimbursable as a cost savings measure. Usually, it's been my experience over my career that when you get into an emergency and you're using a cost reimbursable vehicle, usually cost is secondary towards addressing the significant risk that is at hand. In this case, however, we were successful in using that tool rather than traditional firm fixed price contracting approach in order to save the federal government money. And then we also got into, a lot of times when you have breaches to be plugged, you preface the breach with rock before you place material over top of it, cohesive and non-cohesive materials. Rock was a big problem. As you can well imagine, while we got hammered with our levee system, a lot of other industry, Department of Transportation with roads, we had heavily impacted interstate systems, railroads. BNSF was heavily impacted and largely bought up a lot of the local rock that was impactful for our ability to be able to go in and plug those 50 breaches. So just a 100,000 foot perspective. In my career, we had the flood of 93, largely lower basin. We had some damaged levees within Omaha, not a significant cost. These aren't escalated costs, but still $85 million in 93, significant chunk of change. 97 was a heavy flow year, didn't have any breaches within the Omaha district. 2011, we talked, was pretty catastrophic. 5 breaches that we highlight here, $250 million south of Omaha to fix the levee systems that we're currently finalizing repair on right now. About $250 million were also expensed north of Omaha on the main stem dams because they were used pretty hard. They had higher flows through the dam system up in Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota during the flood of 11. And that's the atypical component of, you really can't compare 11 and 19. 2019, you see this dark gray box, 52 breaches, largely all attributed to overtopping. This was in 2011. It was high flows for long periods of time, and you ended up with seepage through the levee that ended up piping material, leading to the failure event. For 2019, it was largely predicated by flows over top of the levee, leading to erosive forces on the downhill toe side, which led to failure. Now a bunch of pictures and a bunch of gee whiz factoids. Again, you can see that this is the furthest north levee system adjacent to Omaha. It's just south of Council Bluffs, L611, 614. This is where the Platte River comes into the Missouri River. And if you look at a map, you can see it's kind of a right turn for the Platte. It says get to the Missouri, hang a right, go on down to the Gulf. Well, it was carrying around 250,000 CFS at the time of the peak point of the flood. We don't know for sure because all of the gauging stations were ripped out by the high flows, but it came powering through the Missouri and basically ripped through L611 levee system, left a lot of scour, deposited an incredible amount of material before it started making its way on the dry side, the landward side of the levee system, and proceeded to wreak havoc as it continued to go downstream, overtopping and breaching all the levees as it moved south. Here's the initial breach. You see this kind of an eyebrow in the furthest left picture. Reason the Corps of Engineers does that is because you could go straight through, but the scour hole that is left is significant in nature, and it's easier, cheaper, and faster to make this eyebrow and put that in place in lieu of trying to pass through the significant scour hole caused by the event. Within 3 weeks of the flood event, we had already had contract awarded and contractors out there working. You can see them working on finalization and setting that breach repair in place within the other 2 pictures.
Ted, you have a bunch of go-to contractors in this case then.
Absolutely. See, we have what we call a rapid disaster infrastructure suite of contracts in conjunction with our rapid response contract vehicles. Seasoned, trained contractors, they acted in the prime capacity. What I find very interesting and gratifying is for this flood event, obviously a lot of significantly impacted ag community. A lot of the primes leveraged local capabilities, a lot of these local ag communities, and used their farming equipment, their equipment to move the material necessary in order to effect repair.
Understood.
So that was a great news story, really a win. If you can call any part of this devastation a win, it was working with the local communities and having those opportunities for them to be able to at least recoup a little bit of the damages wrought. You get a little bit further south, you transition, from L 611, 614, 602, you get down to L575, multiple breaches. In the left picture, you can see the 4 dots right adjacent to just to the left of Thurman. There's a tieback between levee systems at Thurman, and that's where you transition into L575. These tiebacks that follow basically go on a tributary going up to the bluff. Both of the tiebacks were impacted and breached. So this shows a picture of some of that breach. You get a little bit further south into L575A breach, and again, they all got named. They were all worked on the basis of their priorities as we work north to south to try to effect repair as the system drained out. You can see in this case the scour hole was 35 feet below ground. Flow obviously coming from the Missouri into the breach, and then over the passage of time as the Missouri crested and went down, you saw the transition of flow from the dryland side out to the river. This shows the initial repairs. The contractors are out there while flow is ongoing. We weren't in a position to wait for all of the high water to go down. We got out there and we're pushing sand and working in these communities. And it was interesting watching the final closure, because obviously you start squeezing flow, your velocities increase, and they're carrying the sand almost as fast as we were pushing the sand in. And then these sand berms are ultimately capped with cohesive material, which provided another opportunity for us to think innovatively about how do you place cohesive in the middle of winter. And we had some new innovative ideas that we provided as well. The B breach has its own interesting story. During the peak of the flow, this B breach flow was the 3rd largest river in the state of Iowa. And when you got the Mississippi on the left bank and the Missouri on the right bank, you can imagine it was carrying a monumental amount of flow as it transitioned from the Missouri inland, and then from inland back out to the Missouri. So very difficult breach to seal. Took a significant period of time. We talked about those subsequent flood events that happened. Excuse me. This was heavily impacted by subsequent flood events. Contractors out there trying to seal the breach while the river's coming up as a result of significant rainfall events that occurred in the May timeframe. This B breach, we originally awarded the initial closure in 19 April. So again, we're getting a little bit further south. This is a month after the event, and the contractor's working hard to begin the process. As you can imagine, you've got water everywhere. The entire floodplain for the Missouri River is a better part of 10 miles wide. So you basically got 10 miles of soggy. So we ended up leveraging systems to be able to dredge systems to be able to place material within the breach area from the riverside, because it was very difficult to be able to access from the supposed dry side or land side. So this wasn't a question in many points of being able to truck in material in order to fill the breach. Some of these breaches we used dredge material, which was a very successful approach to being able to get that initial plug in place. Here's that final picture of the B breach, and you can see the, yes, go ahead.
Basically, you took the sand that the river had spread about and put it back.
Exactly. And then followed all of that up with a cohesive clay surfacing in order to obviously prevent that sand material from eroding over the passage of time. This B breach is kind of important to look at on the right picture. So the final flood event, the second rainfall event in September, which was incredibly wet, river's coming up. You can see it's out of its banks already, and it began to chew away at this completed breach area. So we put these chevrons and groins in place in order to obviously reduce the energy of the flow, allow for deposition of material within those fingers in order to protect that, basically that investment of sand and time that we had put in place that would subsequently be capped during the winter of, in this case, 2021 into 2022, or 2020 into 2021, sorry. We're almost all the way to the south end of the system. L550 was the second to last system that we worked, heavily damaged. We had 5 or 6 breaches just within the L550 system alone. Worked closely with state of Iowa, state of Missouri. We're transitioning into the state of Missouri down in 550. And 536 was exclusively state of Missouri. You can see, again, the magnitude of these breaches. Oftentimes very difficult to figure out what's the riverside as you look at some of these photographs. Here, 550, you can see the breach repairs on the right after we've had the opportunity. And again, to travel along the crest of the levee was an adventure in and of itself. Very challenging, very difficult. You basically had to be able to have your breach plugged in order to be able to provide access to further south systems. This is L536. I don't know, it is 550 still. I'm sorry. Next slide's 536. But it shows the final area. You can see that a lot of the summer's transitioned. We're already into fall and winter. You can see snow on the ground. And once again, very proud of the fact that in 2011, we figured out that you could work in the winter in Nebraska and Iowa. We applied those lessons during 2019. It's hard to do. It's difficult to do. We had a period of cold snap in February of 21 where we were running 10 to 15 below. And obviously, when you're trying to measure or manage the moisture content within the clay material that's going to go on and it's all starting to freeze up, we tried to get after that through the use of some innovative approaches. We put up sprung structures and heated inside of those sprung structures and managed dirt within those sprung structures in order to make it workable for subsequent placement. So expensive, but when you start looking at time value of money and being able to affect repair quickly, vice having this stretch out over long periods of time, it became cost effective for us to be able to continue these operations. Here's 536, and really it has been a poster child for a lot of success. We, in essence, moved the levee system back and allowed for the better part of 1,000 acres of what had previously been protected cropland to now be on the wet side of the levee. And as you can well imagine, if you're the landowner who's being approached by the community or by the levee sponsor to say, hey, we got a great idea. We're talking about moving the levee back to give the river a little bit more room to grow because it failed in 93, it failed in 2011, it failed. In 2019, we'd really like to try to do things differently. What do you think about us moving the levee and then you're going to have cropland that's not protected? That's not a very palatable conversation for those landowners. So there became a long conversation with those landowners to figure out what can we do, what can NRCS do with some of their permanent wetland easement programs, what can the local communities do, what can the state do to supplement, to ensure that those ag interests are not long-term negatively impacted, because it's been my experience that when you're on the wet side, if you're fortunate, you get crop 3 year out of 10, because some of these areas will still be cropped. And basically the ag community is looking towards, hoping that it's a moderate moisture year that allows for them to be able to gain harvest, versus on the dry side, again, it's supposed to be one of those situations where they can count on production 10 years out of 10. So this, as you can see, we had 5 significant breaches in L536, nearly a half a mile in length total. You see that inset picture that shows the dramatic damages. It looked like Swiss cheese as you looked at the top of the levee. It was undrivable. We also used some innovative dredging approaches to be able to provide material from the Missouri River into these breach closures. And the next picture, I think, shows an overview of this offset or this setback. And on the right picture, you can see the original levee configuration adjacent to the river, tight constrict on the river, to the setback, which provided the opportunity for the river to have access to the floodway, and gives it a little bit more of an opportunity to be able to carry additional flow. All of this within the construct of the PL 8499 program. The way we were able to do this was to look at the cost of repair along the original alignment. That has to be contrasted with the cost of construction for this new setback, and the costs have to be equal. You can't spend more on the cost of repair or the cost of the new system setback than you could on the original. That was an important lesson learned. We worked very closely with our higher headquarters in Washington and in Portland to ensure that we were in conformance with law and that we're meeting the authorized purpose of this levee system. And it became a huge success. Once again, working with Nature Conservancy, they did a lot of the heavy lifting, working with the ag community and the landowners, and ultimately we were successful in getting that setback. Some more of the lessons learned. When flood of 11 happened, it was all hands on deck. How are we going to get after fixing this? And within Omaha District, what I did is I took a cadre of staff and basically established a brand new branch within the project planning and management group that I called the Omaha System Restoration Team. And it's a matrixed organization where I have staff from construction and engineering and contracting and council and everybody that is necessary in order to execute mission, had a devoted responsibility, in that case for the better part of 18 months, in order to ensure that we have provided the devoted attention necessary to accomplish a significant lift. In that case, it was $500,000. So unfortunately, when 2019 came and the flood was ongoing, I knew exactly what needed to be done, which was System Restoration Team version 2. So we incorporated some of the lessons learned that we had gone through with the SRT. A lot of lessons learned with respect to real estate and management of real estate. Real estate is a levy sponsor responsibility, can oftentimes be the long pole in the tent in terms of gaining access to the project site. So working through some of those elements, applying those lessons learned, we stood up this OSRT version 2, and that focused recovery team is very much instrumental in success of repairs, basically, like I said, better part of $700 million in a short couple of years. We took some heavy hits within the Corps, within Omaha District. There was a lot of buzz that we failed to communicate effectively during the flood event. From a Corps of Engineers perspective, we can all point fingers anywhere we want, but usually when you point a finger, you got 4 of them pointing back at you. What I found was effective communication is the toughest thing that we do. I think that we learned from 19, and we've applied lessons to more effectively communicate with local and state EMs. 19 was hard because it was transitional from this shouldn't be a big deal to this is a really big deal over the course of about 30 hours. And that's where I think that the communication was negatively impacted. So we took very seriously some of those criticisms. That was an oft-repeated remark on the part of many of the state agencies we dealt with, and we're committed to working closely with the CODELs and with the states in order to ensure that they know what we know, what the weather experts know, in order to get after it. Surveillance from helicopters, absolutely vital. In 2011, technology was such that you couldn't hover over a site, snap a picture with your cell phone, and have it geosynced to where that location was. It's amazing what basically 8 years will do from technology perspective. We were able to leverage the capability of being able to geosync real-time data with my engineering staff so that we are able to ensure that the construction contractor who's kind of operating in a void, we don't have 1,000 sheets of drawings that depict what the finished product is going to look like. I've got a slide coming up here where I have a standard detail that we applied, but the rotary wing surveillance was absolutely essential for us to be able to begin the process of understanding quantities and understanding how we're going to be able to get after repair. 8499, I can't say enough good things about it. It's an incredibly efficient, effective tool. For Omaha District, the vast majority of the levee systems under our responsibility are 100% federal, which means there's no non-federal cost share. Non-federal cost shares typically take time. There's a responsibility on the part of that non-fed sponsor to have to come up with the money. That can be difficult and challenging, especially if they just got done doing a significant lift for repairs as recently as 2011. So from that perspective, 8499 is a great program. And as part of this exercise, and as part of the drive from the 4 governors to say, do things differently, we really focused on looking at the Missouri River as a conveyance tube and understanding where are we constricted. And you would think logically from a hydraulics perspective, when you start at the north and you go to the south, you would progressively gain greater flow carrying capacity as you move downriver. The sad reality is no, you don't. There are areas within the river where you've got a lot of carrying capacity up north, you transition down, it necks down, it doesn't have the carrying capacity, widens back up again. So it's inconsistent. And those are some of the things that we learned. And in conjunction with that, we learned, for example, at Highway 2 at Nebraska City has been a widely known constriction point for decades. As a result of the flood of 19, the state of Iowa made a deliberate decision to modify that bridge embankment and roadway in order to provide greater carrying capacity for the river underneath that Highway 2 bridge. Big success. I think it cost the state of Iowa in the range of $20 to $30 million, but they were committed to effecting repair and doing things differently. And we made a lot of recommendations. Floods on the Missouri River have been well-studied phenomenon, and we continue to go back to the lessons learned, even as far back as 93, and look at the tools that have been developed to be able to see if there's opportunities for us to implement them as we move into the future. I talked a little bit about trying to get into the 21st century, you got to remember a lot of these levee systems were constructed with the use of relief wells on the dry side in order to reduce pore pressure so that you didn't have issues with flow through the levee system. I think it's been everybody's experience that over the passage of a half a century, relief wells, typically, they're not maintained really well. Typically, they're going to foul. Typically, they're not there when you need them. We recognize that, and we have really embraced this construct of seepage berms, both upstream and downstream on dry side and wet side, in order to provide a longer hydraulic path, which prevents that piping of material through the levee and prevents the failure. We applied this post 2011. We refined it and really applied it in 2019. And I'm happy to say that all of the 5 breaches that were fixed post flood of 11, none of those levee segments had any issues or challenges during flood of 2019. So this is an opportunity where, again, we're trying to think differently. We're trying to be more resilient. And this was one of the lessons learned that I think becomes a national standard as we move forward.
Ted, on those 5, was there water observed leaching through? So there was still wet. There was still a wet. The dry side was still got wet, but it didn't have the turbulent effect.
We are effectively, when we're doing the breach closures, the water is very high. You still can't see the extent of damages and the scallops that are on the face of the levees where maybe the sod's been removed and you've gotten significant portions of the levee damaged. During the initial repair, when they're out there that first year, plugging the 50 breaches, we got high water. With the passage of time, as you transition from first year into second year, water begins to recede, where we have the exposure for the totality of what we've seen as damages, typically on the wet side. And that's where we are more diligent looking at that long-term solution using that cost reimbursable tool to get out there. And the contractor knows what the finished levee cross-section is going to look like. And at that point, we make decisions with respect to the use and the dimensions associated with the land side for the seepage blanket. And that is predicated by the work my engineering team is doing real time as they're gathering data. Oftentimes they're punching holes with their drill rig in order to determine the cohesiveness of the material. And that in turn defines the direction. So during flood of 19, we did not have a lot of boils. During flood of 11, that was a primary failure mode. And again, that's predicated because the flood of 19 was basically a weak event where water was up, did all the damage, and then we're left with a mess. This, again, kind of cycles back to what many have coined is really one of the more significant areas of resiliency or things that we did differently coming out of the flood of 19, the work that we did at L536. Couldn't get out there. It was just a heck of a mess. It was completely saturated. So we had a lot of drone footage. We worked with industry and basically did a lot of things virtually in order for them to begin to refine their costing approach. We talked about the use of the acquisition vehicle. I think that is a singular success for what we've been able to accomplish there. We talked about dredging from the river. Couldn't get the material in from the dry side, very effective. Winter tent enclosures, that allowed us to be able to work the material during the coldest time of the river. This upper picture, you can see this white structure. That's where they've got that heated structure and they're working material within that ends up being cycled back out for the facing of the levee system. Working with NRCS, they've got their own set of processes, right? You're basically marrying two cultures, Corps and NRCS. They were so super to work with. They committed to working with us. We had high-level conversations with Washington, D.C. staff and leadership in order to figure out how can we leverage and marry their program, which takes longer than what we were asking them to do, and make it effective for what we needed to accomplish. And they bent over backwards to work with us to make it win-win. And again, you can see many agencies, just a concerted effort to be able to set that levee back and provide more room for the levee to go.
Got a question from the field,
Yeah, go ahead.
Christopher Honkamp asked, when you set back the levee, do you have to remove the old one?
That's a great question. And the short answer is you want to remove the old one because it becomes a significant part of the material necessary for the new system. So in our case, universally, we removed the old levee, whether it was on L536 or on L594. We removed the old levee and used that as part of the soil that we needed for the levee, for the new levee setback.
Thank you.
Yep. So you've got the pragmatic hydraulic considerations of giving the river more room to roam, but you also have the environmental impacts and benefits associated with greater diversity. A significant part of the Missouri River Recovery Program talks about mitigative responsibility of the federal government caused by the Bank Stabilization and Navigation Program, which basically channelized the Missouri River from Sioux City south down to the mouth. Part of the federal government's responsibility is to be able to mitigate for the damages caused by that activity. So this L536, you talk about 1,000 acres of reconnected floodplain. You talk about seeing greater diversity, fish, amphibians, birds. It's real. We've seen it in just a very short time since we were successful in doing the setback. And from there, again, a lot of information. I am very excited about the success that we've been able to leverage working with a host of different people, a host of communities, in being really in a position to invest the nation's dollars. And I'm very serious about the investment of basically $750 million to effect repair on this levee system. When Congress back in 1944 and 1958 looked through the Pick-Sloan program, tame the Missouri River, we basically accreted as a nation 540,000 acres of farmland, which feeds the nation, feeds the world. So this investment by the nation in this levee system, our responsibility as the federal government to effect repair and ensure that we are providing that continuing, ongoing mission responsibility, very important. And I'm humble to be able to see how well the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Omaha District responded to an unprecedented event. I thought I was done with big floods after 2011. I really did. Thought I'd never have to see one again. I was happy to take my binders with OSRT version 1 and put them in cold storage. But then 2019 happened, and lo and behold, we were there. And it was hard and difficult, but really a compliment to all the people that engaged to work that. So I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has any questions about some of the things that we did to try to think differently about how we approached this flood event, how to make a more resilient system that would be more successful in addressing future flood events, and just really kind of see what's on your mind as far as questions that you might have. Over.
We have several questions already in the Q&A tab, and I would encourage people to ask away now and write them in the Q&A section or in the chat. The moderators are moving things over for me to see. And I'm going to address several of these to you, Ted. Karen Durham Aguilera says, good to see creative solutions and initiatives being applied. So that's a kudos from earlier on in the presentation.
And I'd like to thank her for that comment, ma'am. It's great to see your name. Wish I could see your face. Obviously you remember 11 very well. I think you got a picture of me standing on a bridge looking wise and pointing off to the future, because that's where the photographer told me to point. But certainly we had some fun times back then. I learned a lot more since then with respect to applying the lessons from 11 to 19. It's funny how quickly we transitioned from flood to drought, because now we're in that significant downturn where we've got concerns about our stakeholders having enough water. So thank you for that comment.
And you certainly have to manage the drought and the flood and everything in between. I mean, this section of river that we're talking about is a exceedingly flat section, about 350 miles long, and flow has everything to do with slope and very little to do with the profile of the river. But as I've learned, water has to mass to move, and it's the massing is the really incredible part. And I also want to give you a lot of credit for what you guys did in managing the flood, because it was, as you said, it was an all hands on deck type of thing. I mean, I did a presentation at JETSI 2 years ago on what the state emergency response team asked the Omaha Post to do in just a small section of the Platte River system, and to see all that material dumped onto, in that case, 160 acres of farmland, to where you could see the top rail of a 5-strand fence. Basically, the elevation change in the field was 3 feet. So all
Absolutely.
That material, you can take some of that back, or most of it back, and put it back in the hole. That's amazing.
And I really didn't have the opportunity, since I was really focused on the river system itself. As you're well aware, Breck, Offutt Air Force Base was heavily impacted as a result of this flood. I didn't talk any right bank things, but we had failures on the R613, 616 levee system that impacted up to a third of Offutt Air Force Base was underwater. So if you flew over the installation and you see this very long runway and a third of it being underwater is not a good view. It's not a good look. Thankfully, the Stratcom facility that we had just finished constructing was completely not impacted by the flood event, but anything adjacent or at a lower elevation was impacted. So fast forward to 2022 and into 2023 and 4, we're working very closely with Offutt and with AFCEC to effect repair at Offutt Air Force Base as a result of damages related to this Missouri River flood.
But that levee breach actually contributed to storage. And
correct.
One of the things that isn't feasible, and I'm curious how this was described to the 4 governors, is that there really isn't an ability to add a Fort Randall type of dam to anywhere on the topography. And I'm curious how that was addressed, because I'm sure they asked the question.
Oh, absolutely. And many of you may be aware that, when Pick Sloan laid out their plan, there weren't 6 dams. There were more dams than that. There was a dam further south of Gavin's Point along the Nebraska-Iowa border. You don't go that much further north of Council Bluffs before you find a constriction in the river, and that was the preferred or projected location. But then you got to look at the passage of time. It didn't get built. I would offer, from my vantage point, that it is highly unlikely that the nation is going to invest the capital. I think last time I checked, some of these dams would run in current dollars, $3 to $4 billion for construction. But aside from that, we all recognize that dams in and of themselves, they provide great benefit. But there's also negatives. It can negatively impact the environment. So I think in 2020 plus, I don't think the nation's in a position where it has the appetite to look towards additional storage on the Missouri River. And certainly as you get further south, becomes even a greater impediment. So I think it was the sweet spot in history where in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the nation was in a position and just been devastated by floods, specifically in the 50s, that heavily impacted Omaha, Nebraska. But that was the driver towards, this genesis or this thought for Pick Sloan But that was never really constructed to its totality. I think we have a pretty good system. Anybody that looks at river and river hydrology knows that we're backwards. Reservoirs are supposed to be way down south. But in this case, all the reservoirs are north. And we were captured for the flood of 2019 by those unregulated flows. And that bombogenesis, which is a cool word, what a mess.
But the 2011 flood and 2019 flood are two very different rain events too, as you described earlier on. I mean, the 2011 was almost an extended amount of time due to the snow melt, where 2019 was one huge flash in the pan.
Absolutely. 2011 had one of the highest snowpacks on record. We had 15 inches of rain over northwest Wyoming, southeast Montana, southwest North Dakota, and a little bit of South Dakota that covered a vast area, filled up all the reservoirs to capacity. And then we were stuck in a pickle of you need to evacuate the water. Otherwise, it can be a catastrophic impact to the nation. So that forced a very long duration flow up to 160,000 CFS, as we had talked about. We had water lapping at the top of the spillway gates of all of the main stem dams. It was beautiful, scary, tons of different emotions. But I will say our dam safety officer didn't sleep for like 3 months. But
I can appreciate that.
It was an amazing flood. 2019, much quicker. And I will tell you that sinking feeling and that pit in your stomach was very real, as Commander and I had that opportunity to fly, with a helicopter and see the devastation and the flows from bluff to bluff, 10 miles of water, and what should have been levees holding back that water, completely inundated and ravaged by this catastrophic event.
Understood. Seth Adamanis asked a question regarding materials in the, as far as the innovation side of things. Have we talked about the particular element here is Gigacrete regarding their robust waterproof coating / crystalline bonding process to use in conjunction with the levees and other solutions?
I appreciate that note, and I'm going to share that with some of my geotechnical staff. I love and applaud the innovation. When we have the opportunity, every year we have different events with industry where we're constantly trying to figure out how can we hold back low head water. We work to be able to apply new technologies in an unusual way. To me, I am not familiar with Gigacrete, but I'm going to have my folks engaged to be able to find out if there's applications as we look to the future.
Carl, I see the slide flashing.
I think that just means that we've probably maxed our time, but
yeah.
I don't have a meeting upcoming, so if anybody has additional questions, I'm happy to.
Darsh Gandhi had asked a particular question regarding, did the levee breach had any investigation done and the reasons it caused it, as such as soils used during construction? Some like we found out in, say, for example, the levees around New Orleans after the Katrina flood event,
right?
Where the soils might have caused the breach. Right. Did you find any of that?
In this case, the cause and effect was so obvious. There was not a need to do any significant forensic activity because you could actually see, like I say, whether in the helicopter ride or even post, as the flows came over the levee. We all know how the tail has all the erosive energy, and that chewed into the face of the levee, removed the vegetative material that had been established. Upon removal of that vegetative material, it just moved and migrated all of the clay surfacing, subsequently got to the sand, and then it was Katie bar the door. And so we didn't have to do any forensics on this activity because it didn't take long once the levee started overtopping to see those catastrophic failures. You saw the catastrophic failures. And in essence, what that did, if you want to look for a silver lining for 52 breaches and $700 million worth of damage, the silver lining is, had all of those levees not breached, St. Joe would have gotten waxed. Maybe Kansas City would have gotten waxed, because all of those breaches obviously provided for carrying capacity of water in the overburden area, and caused all the challenges that we saw. But St. Joe, as I recall, they were within inches of overtopping their levee within downtown St. Joe. So, and like I say, I say that tongue in cheek. There's nothing good about this flood event. There was a positive in that there was no loss of life directly attributable to the flood. I know there were some drownings unrelated to the flood, but it was just significant impacts of the flood. You can't. It's far too early to make any off the cuff light remarks about it. Over.
All right. That's a good point. I want to shift to a moment here. The mega project execution. Did you get feedback on that? I remember in 2011, the people with pitchforks and torches ready to burn down Robert Rusk's front door.
Yeah.
Has there been an increase in the level of trust and good feedback, or good or negative, following the 2019 flood?
Well, unfortunately, I was really experienced in that, and both Colonel Rook and General McMahon made me proud to be an American with how they successfully managed and worked with very irate community and a number of public events, because there was a lot of people hurting. So they did a phenomenal job. From again, just analytical, disengaged kind of perspective, outside looking in, I will tell you that if we come out of a flood event with a neutral public opinion, which by the way we never do, that would be considered a phenomenal success. The sad reality is, when people are hurting, sometimes the Corps of Engineers is an easy target, and that is a reality, and I'm fine with that. I get to deal with the facts, and I get to deal with the repair and get the benefit of seeing the positive consequences of the rebuild and work with people. But since there were a lot of Corps of Engineers employees themselves that lost their homes related to the flood of 19. They lived closer to the river, levees breached, and they lost their homes, lost everything they had. So this wasn't limited to people that I don't know or didn't know. I've got close friends that were very negatively impacted. All I can say is it's effective communication. It is incredibly difficult to marshal the appropriate people, get everybody in the room talking on the same sheet of music and understanding the priorities and the requirements and the needs. But that's the Corps of Engineers' responsibility. We're trained to do this. We're trained to respond to these type of events. We don't always get it right, but we do always try to learn from any event.
Well, and one of the questions that Carl Lucas put on here, and follows up to the mega project execution element, and that stable that I mentioned earlier during your presentation when I interrupted you. Is there an opportunity for coordination with local, minority, and small businesses in advance to have additional resources and at various locations around the nation to have ready capacity?
Yep. Yes, and again, that's a great comment, because Omaha District takes very seriously its responsibility to small business. Once again, I'm proud of a lot of things. I work in the best district in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I call it the Omaha District for good reason, because we execute mission. Part of that responsibility, though, circles around leveraging and building up and developing small businesses so they become a vital part of our toolkit in order for us to execute mission. We do a lot of our work through the auspices of multiple award task order contracts, MATOCs, and single award, SATOCs. So those tools where we specifically go out and we're going to say we want maybe it's a service disabled veteran-owned small business, SDVOSB, or maybe it's a woman-owned small business, or maybe it's a hub zone. We very deliberately target small business entities in conjunction with our unrestricted partners in order to ensure that when these type of events occur, that we are pre-positioned and have the tools on hand to be able to very quickly address the repairs. This also, we're talking a little bit about acquisition. We had something called a pre-qualification contract vehicle, which to my understanding, we'd only used down in Fort Worth district. Kudos to them for piloting that as an initiative. But in essence, what we did is we pre-qualified many small businesses, hub zones, told them, hey, we got a bunch of dirt to push, levees to fix, seeding, sodding, that type of work to be done. Y'all send in your quals and we're going to validate and we're going to shortlist a bunch of people. And then when packages are prepared, we will go to you and allow you to bid it. And effectively, by using this pre-qual approach, took a little bit of time while we were gathering our resources, marshaling what the final design was going to look like. And then when a specific project, mostly on our tributary work, maybe on Elkhorn or the Platte or the Loop, we were all over the state, we would go to that pre-qual list, basically provide those contractors really a very limited nominal period of time, 14 days in some cases, where they would provide proposals and then we would get award. So,
and the federal side of things is only one element here. I mean, granted, you're dealing with the biggest part of it, but all the county emergency management agencies, the state emergency management agencies, everybody needed somebody. Particularly as I observed around Fremont, there were a number of contractors everybody was involved in trying to fill some of the breaches along the Platte. So, I mean, it was a huge event, and I'm not sure anybody felt like they didn't get a piece of the action.
Absolutely. All hands on deck.
We have exhausted the questions save one. And it gives me an opportunity to segue. But Ted, is there anything more you want to add on the topic?
No, I certainly appreciate the audience. I know everyone's time is valuable, and I'm glad that maybe this presentation struck a chord or was of some interest to you. Certainly, I'm available if anybody would like to have a sidebar. But I thank everyone for their time. Yes,
I do too. Because Jeffrey Compo has said basically excellent presentation. It is being recorded, Jeff. It's will be posted in about a week. As soon as the recording gets compiled, and awesome. The presentation will be posted in the handouts tab very soon. The national office is having a slight issue with connectivity today. They managed to do marvelous things to get this presentation out the door as advertised and as scheduled. So I'm thanking very much the national staff for what we're doing and making these presentations available to the society. So for the 38 people who have stuck with us pretty much through the entire 80 minutes now, thank you again. I want to give you a quick download of some upcoming events, more beautiful topics like what we've just experienced today. So the next webinar on electric vehicle and infrastructure planning, that's coming up on the 22nd of June. And the next slide is for the Pfas sampling and considerations. That one's coming up on the following day on the 23rd. I know there's also a webinar that's coming up on the 15th of June put out by the Resilience COI. We are pushing forward as much content from the national office, national set of volunteers as we possibly can. Look for many initiatives to continue to be put forward. We're looking at a speakers bureau and making that come to reality on the resilience side of things. So if you want to hear more resilience topics, that will soon be available on the communities of interest tabs, particularly for mine, the resilience one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time today. Appreciate all the fine questions. Ted, again, thank you for telling the story about what resulted from answering the 4 governors and how while we can do lots of things, we can't do everything. So signing off from here. Thank you.
Thanks,
Appreciate your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you.